same title, The Value of Uncertainty. So what I want to try to do today is to just, first of all, say a few words about the point of our lecture series that we've organized in the special issue, where the aim is to try to bring together the active inference framework or predictive processing and show how it can help us to understand the nature of well-being. So I want to say a little bit about that project, and then the main aim of the talk is to try to point to how uncertainty can be, under certain conditions, in certain contexts, of positive value to a subject. It can make positive contributions to the well-being of that subject. And I'm going to focus on the example of play, which is a little bit different from what I advertised in my abstract. And I probably won't get to talk too much about niche construction, although on our view, play turns out to be an example of niche construction. So the ideas about structuring the environment in ways that allow us to productively explore uncertainty, which is one of the themes in this Aon article. That's going to come into my talk through thinking about the contribution of play to well-being. So that's what I want to try to do today. And I'm just going to start by nodding my head to this excellent Aon essay, which everyone should read if they haven't already done so. So first of all, about the general project of trying to use active inference predictive processing to understand this concept of subjective well-being. So in the background here is the idea that there could be a cognitive science of subjective well-being. It's something that we could make sense of as a feature of biologically evolved beings who live in a material world. And cognitive science could help us to make sense of what it might be for such a being, such a creature, to live a meaningful life. So immediately you might have some reservations about such a project. You might think, well, such a view of what we are as human beings, we're evolved biological beings, that we live in a physical universe, already kind of robs us of what's required to make sense of meaning. You might think that there's such a picture of who we are and such a picture of the world has no room for meaning in it. Meaning is somehow left out. And so part of the project here is to say, no, that's not the case. That what cognitive science can help us to do is, first of all, understand the nature of well-being, the causes, the constituents of well-being, but it might also help us to identify some of the ways in which well-being can be facilitated in human beings as well. Once we better understand its nature, once we better understand the causes and the constituents of well-being. So the project is to look for the neurocognitive mechanisms that enable, that constitute subjective well-being. And the approach that we're taking in this lecture series is to look at computational models and to argue that they may help us to learn something about what those causes, constituents, what the nature of subjective well-being is. So the project is to explain SWB, subjective well-being, in terms of inferential mechanisms. And those are the sort of mechanisms that you can model computationally, because what computer models give you is a model of inference, of reasoning under uncertain conditions, which is something that I'm going to talk about much more in my talk. So we could look for inferential mechanisms then that might lead to the formation of positive self-beliefs. So we're understanding learning and behavior by reference to these inferential mechanisms, then looking for maybe differences in learning and behavior that account for individual differences in well-being, and trying to make sense of those individual differences by reference, first of all, to inferential mechanisms. And the way that I think about those inferential mechanisms myself and with other colleagues is in inactive terms. So I think of those inferential mechanisms as what Andy Clark would call action-oriented, or as control mechanisms. So what we're looking for are control mechanisms that might account for individual differences in learning and behavior that underlie these individual differences in how well-being is experienced. So that's the project. You're going to see a series of talks for those of you who attend this lecture series that kind of explore that question from different directions. And eventually that's going to lead to our special issue in neuroscience of consciousness that we're putting together. So what is subjective well-being exactly? Well, I want to start by saying it's not exactly identical with maximizing pleasure and avoiding suffering. So we can't quite line it up with a hedonic view of well-being, because that would just give us too short-term a picture of what well-being is and miss the complexity of it as well. And the second reason for thinking that there must be more to well-being than just maximization of pleasure and avoiding suffering is because suffering can sometimes itself be pleasurable. So think about immersing yourself in a hot bath, to give one of Paul Bloom's examples, or bringing up young children. There's a lot of suffering that comes with that, but it's also a source of enormous pleasure. So this kind of dichotomy between pleasure and suffering doesn't really help to make sense of well-being, and it doesn't really hold up in practice. I just threw in a quote here that I found in the Paul Bloom book from Jordan Peterson. I think this is somewhat of an overstatement, but Peterson suggests that the purpose of life is finding the largest burden you can bear and then bearing it. So that's a kind of stoic picture that he's offering there of what well-being might be. But it's definitely pushing back against this idea that that the meaningful life, the life of flourishing, comes from pleasure maximization. If Peterson's right, it's the opposite. So the picture that I'm going to be working with in this talk is what Paul Bloom calls motivational pluralism. There are labels that philosophers give to a similar kind of position, where there are many things that people want. They're going to include things like social justice, fairness, peak experiences, good friendships, loving relationships, maybe power, purpose in their lives. So basically we should think that well-being, just like life, is extremely complicated, has these different dimensions to it. And so going back to the idea of computational models again, the question is whether we could model differences in learning and behavior that might help us to understand these ingredients and how these different ingredients contribute to subjective well-being. The picture that's familiar to most people here is coming from predictive processing. So the idea that human experience in the end is the result of lots of predictions going on in the brain and in the body at multiple scales over different time scales, different spatial scales. So what's being fed down the predictive hierarchy of these predictions, and they're being met with sensory states that are coming in from the world. Then there's some kind of comparison that's being made to compute prediction errors. So on this picture, you can think of predictions as like presuppositions that come from our past learning that the brain is operating with. Then it's using those presuppositions about what's likely to happen in the world, comparing that with incoming sensory information to compute prediction errors. And then we think that perhaps a driving imperative for biological systems like us is to keep those prediction errors to a minimum over time. And the result of that will be that you end up meeting your preferences most of the time, satisfying your preferences if you think of those preferences as predictions, as expected states. So that's the general picture that we're going to be operating with in thinking about how to model the ingredients of subjective well-being. And you might think immediately that unpredictability, uncertainty, so I'm just going to understand uncertainty as unpredictability relative to what's known, you might think that it follows from this predictive processing active inference picture. Just going to use those terms as coextensive. I know that's a little bit controversial, but let's not worry about that too much. But if we think of uncertainty in terms of unpredictability, predictive processing is aiming at the minimization of prediction errors over time, then it should be the case that uncertainty is always negative, negatively valenced, always aversive, unpleasant for a creature that aims at prediction error minimization. Because what uncertainty amounts to is unpredictability relative to what's known. And you might think then that a creature that's in the business of minimizing prediction error should be going out of its way to avoid unpredictability, to avoid uncertainty, understood as unpredictability. So just a little qualification on what uncertainty is. So we know from the Aon article, we need to distinguish between expected uncertainty and unexpected uncertainty. So expected uncertainty perhaps isn't so vicious for a creature that aims at prediction error minimization. On the contrary, you're always going to be dealing with some uncertainties. And as long as those uncertainties are expected, then you'll be able to control your actions relatively well relative to those uncertainties. You'll be able to maintain a grip on the incoming sensory information. I'm not going to run through exactly what this distinction amounts to, but just go back to the Aon article if you're worried about it, you're not sure what it tracks exactly. So there's an example there of visiting your favorite restaurant and expecting to be able to eat a particular meal at your favorite restaurant. So there can be some expected uncertainty associated with that, with satisfying that preference. But there can also be some unexpected uncertainties, say if there's a new chef who introduces a new menu. Now, that distinction is only important for my talk insofar as there's this intuition that people might have that uncertainty is always negatively valenced, always unpleasant. And there is a particular kind of uncertainty that certainly is negatively valenced, that comes from volatility. So think about being in the middle of a war zone where things are changing at a rate that is highly unpredictable. So being in that war zone for an extended period of time will lead to predictions that are no longer able to get a good grip on that environment. And the result of sustained exposure to that kind of volatility will be stress, perhaps also anxiety, reduced sense of control over your behavior, a kind of learned helplessness. But the main thing I want to say in my talk is that while that form of uncertainty can be extremely unpleasant, there are also forms of uncertainty that can be just right for us, that are what we would characterize as sweet spots. So it's not necessarily the case that once you think of uncertainty as unpredictability, uncertainty always is negatively valenced. So in play, for instance, humans, other animals, are in the business of creating just the right amount of uncertainty for themselves so that they can make progress in their learning. So they don't want too much novelty or violation of expectation, because that would lead them to lose grip on the environment, lose grip on the sensory information. But nor do they want no novelty or violation of expectation, because that would just be boring, nothing to learn for them. So they want enough uncertainty, enough unpredictability for them to be able to creatively explore, to make progress in playing. And I think that there's something here that's very insightful for thinking about the ingredients for subjective well-being if we reflect on this play example a little bit more. So that's what I want to do in the rest of my talk. I think we can take play, first of all, to be a sign of well-being. So we just know that creatures only engage in play when they're in a safe environment, when there's no threats around. And Mark Anderson, in his little book on play, has suggested that we play when we feel good. So already we might think that there's some kind of relationship here between play and well-being, insofar as you tend to observe play in the wild when creatures are in a good state of well-being. Furthermore, play is intrinsically motivated. So the contrast here is between extrinsic motivation, where there are actions that bring about particular rewards. Those actions are motivated as a means to the ends of achieving those rewards, bringing about those rewards. But play is different in that it's not extrinsically motivated, it's rewarding in itself. So it's rewarding not because it brings about some preferred ends, but it's rewarding as an activity in its own right. So why is it that play is intrinsically valuable in this way for animals? We've argued in our work that that play is enjoyable, that it's fun for us because of the way that we are creating these sensory flows in which there's some kind of subversion of our expectations, of our there's some kind of surprise that we're creating, which is just the right amount of surprise for us. And so we've argued that play can be thought of as intrinsically motivating, as rewarding in its own right, because of the way in which there's that just right surprise that is being created, that is being constructed when we play. But I want to dig into this a little bit more and say that that there's something about curiosity and openness to new experiences, which is also a contributing ingredient to subjective well-being. So playful people are people that who are open to investigating, exploring the world around them and learning about it. They are curious. And there's something about curiosity, I think, that that is interesting here, both for thinking about the value of uncertainty, because curiosity itself is this desire to explore uncertain events, or at least that's how it's been defined. So that desire is not a negative experience that we enjoy. It's not that when we're exploring those uncertain events, that's unpleasant for us. On the contrary, it's something that we enjoy. We have some interest in that kind of uncertainty. It's something that is positively experienced by us. So this connection between curiosity, uncertainty, and play, I think, is very interesting for thinking about what the neurocognitive mechanisms are that underlie well-being. And we could make a connection here, I think, which is intriguing, to self-determination theory and positive psychology, which understands intrinsic motivation in terms of the satisfaction of particular needs that persons have for autonomy, relatedness, and competence. So we could think that each of these needs are satisfied in some way in play. How am I doing for time, Ines? Let me have a quick check. 23, so been going for 20 minutes. Yeah, I've got another 10 minutes to go, so we'll still have lots of time for discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, so so one way to make sense of why curiosity, playfulness, this disposition to be open to exploring, being curious about the world, might contribute to well-being is because, not just because it's enjoyable for us, that would be to think of play just in hedonistic terms, but because it contributes to satisfying these needs. And you might think that's a little bit at odds with what Mark Anderson and myself, Andreas Rupsdorf, and Mark have been arguing, where we've said that play is motivating, it's intrinsically rewarding because it feels good, and it feels good to us because we are reducing prediction errors at a faster than expected rate. So you might think that what I've just said is a little bit at odds with that the contribution of play to well-being must be purely hedonistic. It must be just that play feels good, it's enjoyable, it's pleasurable. Well, I want to say that no, there's more going on actually, and that's already part of our story. That you could think of curiosity and play as intrinsically motivated because these behaviors are satisfying these kinds of needs for autonomy, relatedness, competence. So we would have to work out exactly how play contributes to each of these needs. But think about competence initially. You can see how when you're making progress in learning, which is one of the things that happens through constructing these slopes of error that allow for better than expected rates of reduction in error, you might think that that is contributing to our feeling of being in control, of being competent as agents. So you can see perhaps how play might contribute to satisfying that particular need. But autonomy also, you might think, if play is about constructing this zone of proximal development, what Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development around yourself, where you're constantly working at the edge of your own abilities, there might be something quite empowering about making that kind of progress in learning. So I'm just pointing at a couple of ways in which you might see play as contributing to the satisfying of these kinds of needs. So the core idea in my talk today is that you might think that what happens in play is doing better than expected at meeting these sorts of needs, where these needs are examples of how to think about motivational pluralism again, the different components that might contribute to living well, to flourishing as a human being. And play might be an important ingredient in that, because it's an example of constructing this niche for ourselves in which we're able to do better than expected at meeting these kinds of needs that sustain us as human beings. So here I see Mark Anderson actually in my screen. That's nice to see you here, Mark. I'm going to appeal to a question that I've talked with Mark about, which I find fascinating, and he discusses a little bit in his book. Why is it that adults don't play more? Well, Mark suggests that maybe it's because by the time we become adults, we've done so much of this kind of experimenting, testing out hypotheses that happens in play. We've made so much progress in learning. We've become kind of certain in our predictions, in our expectations about the world. We've become kind of sure about ourselves. And that induces a kind of rigidity, which is actually bad for well-being, I want to say. Look back to Innes's talk about what psychedelics do, kind of shaking up that rigidity, disturbing it, and how that might be important for recovering from severe mental illness like depression or OCD. So those sorts of rigidities that make it the case that we don't, as adults, tend to find play attractive are also actually unhealthy and bad for us. So you might think that one of the ways in which to also be less rigid, more flexible in our thinking, in our expectations about the world, is just to play more, create environments in which we can do that. And what that amounts to is, oh, sorry, I didn't say this yet, but as soon as we become more certain in our model, then we stop being explorative, we stop being open and curious. And that, I want to say, actually interferes with us living meaningful and fulfilling lives. So there's a kind of trade-off here that you'll all be familiar with from the active inference literature and from the reinforcement learning literature, those of you who come from a computational modeling background, between exploring the environment, seeking out new information that allows you to make better predictions, and exploiting what you already know, so just going for the reward every time. Mark and I, in our work on well-being with Eric Rietveld, have been exploring how there's some kind of optimization that's required between these strategies of active inference, where you engage either in what's called pragmatic active inference or epistemic active inference, seeking to maximize either epistemic value by finding new information, sampling new observations that reduce your uncertainty, or by exploiting what you already know. So just engaging in behaviors that allow you to be hedonistic, maximize your pleasure, avoid suffering. And subjective well-being, we think, depends on finding some kind of balance between these two modes of engagement with the world. So what happens in adult life, you might think, is that we allow our exploitative behaviors to actually dominate in our lives. That's a symptom of not playing. We rely too much on our past habits. We get too entrenched in those past habits. And that in the end can be counter to our subjective well-being. So what's necessary then is to be more exploratory, to be more playful, to be more open. And Moshe Bar, in his book on mind wandering, writes about meditation as allowing for immersive experiences of the present. So he thinks that what meditation does for us, mindfulness, is give us a way of optimizing this kind of balance. And I think that's very interesting, that idea. But you could also find that similar kind of immersive experience of the present in moments of play, in moments of curiosity. So I think the crucial ingredient here for coming out of these computational models of subjective well-being, the crucial ingredient could be this openness to exploring. And that could be a crucial ingredient because it can allow for this being in the moment, this kind of immersion in the present. So what seems to be bad for us, I'm using Blake's metaphor here of mind-forged manacles, are predictions that become overly rigid, that trap us into excessively exploitative modes of behavior. I think that fits very well with Innes's paper from last time. So what we need to do is loosen the grip of these expectations. That means controlling somehow the precision that those expectations are given that drive exploitative modes of behavior. That loosening the grip of those precision estimates, those estimates of our own uncertainty, the reliability of our predictions, treating those predictions as less reliable, which is what children do when they play. If we were able to foster more of that playfulness, that could be an ingredient that could help us to live more meaningful lives. So just a way to connect this to attention, and this is something that Barr does as well. You might think that what's called for here is a more kind of open, expansive attending to the world. So rather than this kind of very focused, selective attending, where we attend to only what's relevant to our exploitative behaviors, what could be important for well-being is cultivating this more open, expansive attending to the world. So I have this picture here from Andy Goldsworthy of a land art intervention. And you think about walking through nature and being immersed in your experience of nature such that you could come across something like this that's not a man-made intervention, but it's just there in nature anyway. So having that kind of open, expansive attending to the world, that could itself be crucial for well-being. And the way to kind of cultivate that is through skills, techniques for controlling the deployment of attention. So controlling the estimation of precision, to put that in more formal computational terms. And play gives us a way of doing that through niche construction. We actively construct our niche to to kind of control what we're attending to through that process of niche construction. But there are going to be many other techniques for doing this. And the value of uncertainty paper that I alluded to at the beginning of my talk points to a number of ways of constructing the niche in such a way that we can control the deployment of attention. So what I've tried to do today is to argue that predictive processing, the active inference framework, can help us to identify some of the neurocognitive constituents that are enabling of, that are constitutive of our subjective well-being, human flourishing. And I pointed in particular at play and curiosity, where uncertainty is experienced as having a positive value for us. It's the just right uncertainty that we're creating, but that just right uncertainty is enjoyable for us because it allows us to do better than expected at satisfying those needs which are nourishing of us, are conducive to our own flourishing. Then I've suggested that openness, exploration, might be thought of as behavioral constituents of subjective well-being, and that underpinning computationally this kind of openness is the controlled deployment of precision, where that control of precision happens through a process of niche construction. And I've used play as my particular example of that, but there are other examples that we could find as well: science, arts, literature, filmmaking. These are all examples of, I think, the controlled deployment of precision through niche construction. And what that allows is this Buddhist idea of living in the moment, which I think Buddhists were right to highlight as important for human flourishing. So thanks for your attention. Questions?
Thanks so much, Julian. So brilliant. Who would like to go first? Okay, Andy.
Hi there. Yeah, that was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. So I agree with everything that you said, and I just want to